Alright, y'all, it's D-Lo. I'm back with another. So I want to talk a little bit about Canelo Alvarez and Errol Spence Jr. Okay? We know that Errol Spence Jr. has mentioned wanting to fight Canelo Alvarez in the future. Canelo Alvarez has talked about coming down to 160 to meet Errol Spence in the future. We saw Errol Spence Jr. interrupt his plans of hanging out at his horse ranch and tending to his horses to go to Canelo Alvarez's fight in Houston last Saturday. Okay? Another thing we saw the SOM take time to interview Canelo Alvarez and speak with him about potentially fighting. Interview Errol Spence and speak to him about potentially fighting Canelo Alvarez, as well as about other fights that he could potentially have. But ultimately, it was about the potential of Errol versus Canelo. Okay. The fact that Canelo Alvarez started talking about Errol Spence Jr. on the heels of Errol Spence Jr.'s pay-per-view showdown with Danny Garcia, in and of itself brought attention to a Canelo fight that basically didn't have much buzz, didn't have much legs, and it was a fight that people were talking against because there were other guys they would have preferred to see Canelo fight. Okay, for myself, even though I felt like Callum Smith was the man at 168 pounds, when it comes to the guys that I felt like stood the best chance at giving Canelo the fight in which would push him and make Canelo either really have to show everything he had and really go out there and fight hard and win a tough fight, or could potentially go out there and beat Canelo, I just didn't see Smith as that guy. Not coming out of the UK, coming over to Texas for a fight versus a Hispanic fight, I just didn't see it. Talked about that in my build-up to the fight. Okay? But with all of those things being said, with Errol Spence Jr. being a fighter who is on pay-per-view, on the rise, he's on an incline to stardom. Not that he's not already a star, but his star is steadily rising. Canelo is a guy whose star is dwindling. It's starting to dim a little bit. And that was evident when Canelo fought Sergey Kovalev and they waited like an hour to start the fight because they were waiting for more people to come off of a UFC event, hoping that more people would come on and subscribe and click on the viewership of the DAZN app and watch the fight. Then, lo and behold, during this fight with Callum Smith, we see the same thing. The fight prior to the main event had ended, and we waited like another hour before Canelo finally got in the ring. So that doesn't scream superstar. That doesn't scream face of boxing. That doesn't scream the man in the sport of boxing. That screams we got to be careful with how we do things, because at the end of the day, appearances are everything. We need at the end result, this needs to appear to have been a big success. People aren't going to remember that we had to wait an hour to start the event. They're only going to remember the numbers that we reported. So with all of that being said, I feel like Errol Spence Jr. didn't need to go to Canelo's fight, didn't need to interview with DAZN, didn't need to help Canelo drum up support in his fan base or in the sport by fans that may or may not be the biggest Canelo fans, getting them back on board with thinking Canelo is ready to take on all challengers, etc., etc. So I think Errol did Canelo a favor. I'm not sure that it helps him in any way, especially in the court of public appearance when we saw Terrence Crawford at his fight and we saw how that went down. And basically his attitude was, I don't know why Terrence Crawford was here. But then he goes to Canelo's fight, talking about making a fight, etc. And not necessarily saying he wanted to fight next. But then Canelo basically, at the conclusion of it, says, yeah, that's something I'm looking to do down the line. So it's just one of those things where I just felt like I don't want to say it, but I'm going to say it. I felt like Errol kind of bowed down to Canelo in a situation in which he didn't have to, in a situation in which he didn't need to. And in terms of negotiation, and y'all know I don't care nothing about these guys' money, but I do care about these fights getting made. And in the terms of Errol calling himself the big fish and not wanting to concede to others when it comes to negotiations, of course he may be willing to concede to Canelo to get the fight made, but I'm not 100% sure he should. I mean, because when was the last, it's going to be a pay-per-view fight 99% of the time if they fight. I mean, excuse me, 99% chance. And I just can't see how a guy who left pay-per-view and went to fighting on an app can call the shots on a pay-per-view event versus a guy who's doing just as well in terms of when he's had a stadium fight and putting people in, putting butts in seats, but also a guy who's been kind of leading the way in terms of pay-per-view in this current model of pay-per-view that we have. So I just don't know. You know, I mean, that's my opinion on it. I have a lot more to say about it, but I'm going to reserve my comments for now. And I'm just going to kind of sit back and see how it unfolds. This isn't a fight that I'm clamoring to see, but I will make one more statement about it. If with Canelo coming down to 160 and not forcing Errol to come all the way up to 68 and so forth, if he's willing to come down to 160, that does in a way put him at a disadvantage, coming down in weight with Errol coming up in weight, but then it'll be Errol's first fight at the weight more than likely. So, I mean, but at the same time, Canelo's conceding something, so I can respect that. But at the end of the day, you also have guys at 160 pounds, 160, where Canelo carries a belt, and those guys are there wanting Canelo's fight and wanting Canelo to fight him, and he's staying away from all of those guys. I mean, he doesn't want to fight Triple G, who holds a belt at 160 in a third fight. He doesn't want to fight Jamal Charlo, who was his mandatory, and who he basically got stripped in order for Jamal to be the champion. And he doesn't want to fight Demetrius Andrade, who owns the WBO belt. So it would look very suspect, in my opinion, for him to be going down to 160 to fight a welterweight. But he's not want to fight the guys at 140, that 160 that are the other premier best fighters at 160 pounds. D-Lo 404 Boxing, all I got to say on the subject. I'm out. Peace.